Is Fedora the new Ubuntu? The community seems to think so. So Fedora has pretty much won out Linux influencers. Pretty much every Linux influencer that I know of recommends Fedora. So I recently read this XDA article right here. Fedora is becoming the default Linux recommendation, and Ubuntu did this to itself. And it talks about some of the problems that Ubuntu has that eventually has sort of gotten people to stop recommending it. And then it talks about what Fedora is doing that solves these problems. And if we just go on YouTube and type Fedora, pretty much all of these videos are videos that are praising Fedora. I ditched Arch Linux for Fedora. Fedora Linux is awesome. Fedora just did something incredible. The best GNOME distro, the ultimate Linux experience. Is Fedora the best Linux distro ever? And even if we search Fedora is the new Ubuntu right here, boom, Linux Experiment did a video on that 4 years ago. The Linux Cast did a video on this 3 years ago, both. So I think it's fair to say that Fedora has just completely won out Linux influencers. Many of them recommend it as their go-to distribution, including me. Fedora's only behind my own distribution that I built. If we aren't counting my own distribution, then Fedora is my favorite. So that said, is Fedora the new Ubuntu? So let's talk about how we got here in the first place for this to even be something that people are discussing. So first off, what made Ubuntu so special? So Ubuntu came out in 2004 when Linux wasn't that mature. So at the time there were RPM distributions, including Fedora, and RPM distributions at the time just had dependency hell nightmares. And Debian wasn't a very viable option either because it was very difficult to install. As a matter of fact, Linus Torvalds himself wouldn't run Debian because it was too hard to install. And then Ubuntu also shipped with the GNOME 2 desktop, and this was the peak of the GNOME 2 desktop. They had introduced the GNOME Human Interface Guidelines at that point, which made the GNOME 2 desktop look very consistent and organized. And I also think Canonical were marketing geniuses of Ubuntu. They branded it as Linux for human beings. And you could easily get yourself a Ubuntu CD for free if you wanted to try it out. They would ship it to you even. And even in the early days, the Ubuntu desktop was just very recognizable, mostly because it had this brown/orange theme to it that not everyone liked, but whether you liked it or not, it was a very recognizable theme. And when you go to even later Ubuntu releases like a 10.04 here, this is where they started to introduce the ambience theme. This was a very recognizable look, and no other Linux distribution at this time had a look as recognizable as Ubuntu did. I made this video a couple weeks ago called GNOME Killed Distro Identity with libadwaita, and one thing I probably should have mentioned in that video is that the distro identity of Ubuntu is part of what made it the most culturally relevant Linux distribution and the one that the most people know about. And libadwaita, for example, is preventing stuff like that from being able to be replicated today. And libadwaita is preventing something like this from being able to be replicated today in 2026. Now, that's a side note. I just wanted to point that out because people didn't understand the point of that video. But also, just Ubuntu had a very strong community behind it since it was so good when it came out. There were so many people using Ubuntu. Even to this day, there's any issue you have with Ubuntu, you're going to run into someone having the same issue and find some sort of solution. Now, let's talk about Fedora for comparison at the same time. So now back in the 2000s, if you don't know, Fedora became a thing because Red Hat used to have its own desktop distribution of Linux right here, but desktop Linux as a commercial market was a very hard market to compete in because Windows had just such a dominant monopoly at the time. And so this just wasn't very profitable, and Red Hat would go on to become very successful by selling an enterprise Linux distro rather than a desktop distribution. So Fedora, or Fedora Core, which is what it was called at the time, came to be a community continuation of the desktop Red Hat Linux project, and it would also go on to become an upstream of the Red Hat Enterprise Linux distro. But because of all that, Fedora just felt like a RHEL testing ground at the time in the 2000s because Fedora hadn't had a chance to actually come into its own as a Linux distribution yet. And Fedora's release cycles were very aggressive and breaks were common. People back in the day used to joke about Fedora breaking. And part of that was due to RPM dependency hell being a very common thing, as I mentioned earlier, back in the Yum days. Another thing is SE Linux would break a lot. So a lot of people just turn off SE Linux, which would defeat the entire purpose of it. And it wasn't beginner friendly enough for many desktop computers, but it wasn't stable enough to be used for enterprise use because the enterprise people would just use Red Hat. Now then, starting around 2011, community sentiment on Ubuntu would start shifting. So GNOME 3 was a disaster, and I do cover this in a little bit more detail in my video on the Ubuntu platform's downfall. But basically, when GNOME 3 launched, it was completely unusable, and so Canonical was forced to switch off of GNOME 3 to another desktop. Plasma 4 came out about 3 years earlier, but Plasma 4 also had a very terrible launch, and their reputation hadn't yet recovered from the Plasma 4 launch. And then XFCE and LXDE were just not feature complete enough. And then desktops like Cinnamon, Mate, and Budgie didn't exist yet. Plus, Ubuntu was already building the Unity desktop for their Ubuntu Netbook edition. So they ended up switching to the Unity desktop. And then that desktop was very controversial. A lot of people didn't like it. People called it a tablet interface. People thought it was unstable and resource heavy. I liked the Unity desktop, but it's a personal preference thing. And then additionally, Ubuntu would end up adding Amazon search results to the Unity search, and this would basically ping your search string to Amazon. And this was telemetry because it did send Amazon every single search query you made in Ubuntu. But Richard Stallman would go as far to call Ubuntu spyware over this, and this sentiment would stick with the community, and a lot of people thought that Ubuntu was spyware and would refuse to touch it. Now, during this time when Ubuntu would just start becoming controversial, Fedora was starting to stabilize. So Fedora did ship GNOME 3, which hurt Fedora short term, but it also saved them a lot of pain later because they wouldn't have to end up switching back to GNOME 3 later and deal with that. And this kind of turned Fedora into the de facto distribution if you wanted the best GNOME support, and that is part of what Fedora is known for to this day. And then Fedora started transitioning from the Yum package manager to a different package manager called DNF that was just a lot more reliable, although it was known for being very slow still. And Fedora was starting to shake the rel beta stigma that it always used to have. But at this time, Ubuntu was still the go-to distribution. Now, next up, Ubuntu would start going all in on their Snap package manager. So they started shipping out Snap packages starting with Ubuntu 16.04, and Snap packages were controversial because it gave Canonical complete control over the repo. You couldn't have other Snap repos. Also, when they came out, they took longer to start and would run worse, things like that, and the rest of the community would be adapting Flatpak. I have a whole video about why Flatpak succeeded and Snap failed. Additionally, Ubuntu 17.10 would switch back to customized GNOME, which angered all of the people who loved Unity, but it didn't really help much for support because a lot of the Unity haters also hated GNOME because GNOME also had a similar user interface to Unity. It was different, but it was also a lot of the people who hated Unity because the interface was so different, and GNOME also had just a drastically different user interface. Now, Ubuntu would later try and force down snaps for packages like Chromium and Firefox, which that is what really started angering people and started making people look for alternatives. And this is a little hypocritical because I'm kind of doing this even today. It's easy clicks and views, but when a giant distribution that is as known as Ubuntu starts making decisions that are this controversial, it's very easy to milk. So Linux content creators from the time wouldn't stop talking about it, which fueled all the controversy even further. Now, if we compare modern Ubuntu with modern Fedora, Ubuntu is not as stable as it used to be thanks to fast kernels and switching core utils to Rust. And Fedora is also bleeding edge, but when Ubuntu is starting to be less stable, Fedora actually starts looking like a more stable alternative to Ubuntu. It's shipping very similar package stacks nowadays. And then Ubuntu's also, like I said, trying to push snaps first and really get you to use snap packages, while the community mostly prefers Flatpaks. Flatpak has just completely won out in the Linux community. Next, Fedora is usually the first for new Linux things like Wayland and Pipewire are some recent examples, yet even with that, it's still a very stable platform. So a lot of Fedora users feel like they're part of the come up for all of the new Linux technology coming out, which is another reason Fedora has such diehard fans. And then modern DNF5 is super fast. DNF5 is recent. If you haven't tried it and you were annoyed by how slow DNF used to be, this is the solution. And so when Ubuntu started losing all of its goodwill from influencers, Fedora just naturally snuck in and sort of became the replacement for these influencers when they needed some sort of recommendation to give out. That said, yes, like I said, Fedora is my favorite distro that isn't my own distro, but that said, I do not think that it is a new Ubuntu because Ubuntu still has a couple advantages that Fedora doesn't have. For one, Fedora is not beginner friendly. Now, I'm not going to say Fedora is hard. If you just watch like a 10 things things to do after installing Fedora video, something like that. I do work for him, so I am biased here, but Michael Tennell, who does the This Week in Linux show, he has a very good video on things to do after installing Fedora that can easily get you up and running if you want to get into Fedora. But that said, you do still have these post-installation steps. Like if you need any proprietary drivers at all, which if you are an NVIDIA user, you for sure do, then you're going to need to install and set up RPM Fusion. You need that even for codec support too. Additionally, stock GNOME is just not beginner friendly at all. And Fedora still is a bleeding edge distro. So I do not think Fedora is a good first distro for a lot of people, but I do think it is one of the best second distros for a lot of people if you're trying to get into the next level of Linux. That said, another major problem for Fedora is it doesn't have a Fedora LTS. And the reason that's a problem to me is because part of what made Ubuntu so successful is Ubuntu LTS was the perfect base distribution for new experiences because you got a reliable package base that was also good for beginners, but it was stable and you only had to deal with a new release every 2 years. So if you're trying to make a really custom and tailored experience, Ubuntu LTS was the perfect starting ground because a lot of the time when you're making such a tailored experience on a lot of other distro bases, you have to keep updating things as packages get updated, and it's a lot of work to do that fast, whereas Ubuntu LTS would give you a consistent 2-year dev cycle that gave you a lot of time to implement a lot of changes you would need to make for a newer package base. So there's countless examples of this. There's Linux Mint. They invented the Cinnamon desktop and XApps and a bunch of other things. It is one of the most loved distributions. And now you have Pop! OS building the Cosmic desktop on top of a Ubuntu base, which that's another loved distribution. Elementary OS, you have the Pantheon desktop and you have all of the elementary apps. They're able to build their entire own ecosystem built on top of Ubuntu. And then you have Zorin OS and Farron OS, both of which are beautiful, super customized desktops, with Zorin OS being GNOME and Farron OS being KDE, and both of them have layout switching and things like that. Just a lot of good quality of life features. And Ubuntu LTS just made sense as a platform to build all these experiences on, even if nowadays the Ubuntu platform is pretty shaky. Now, some may argue Red Hat Enterprise Linux is kind of a Fedora LTS, but they aren't the same. Yes, if you are running Red Hat, it functionally is the same thing as just running an older version of Fedora with security updates. But the two biggest problems is Red Hat Enterprise Linux is a paid distribution. They do have a free version, but you get a limited number of devices and you still have to activate it, which is annoying. So if you want free Red Hat, you might as well use a community maintained fork like Alma Linux or Rocky Linux. And that is where most community use of Red Hat comes in. And then additionally, because Red Hat is a corporate enterprise focused Linux distribution, the repository is much smaller because they only want to provide packages that they actually know that they can support on a enterprise level, whereas Ubuntu LTS has all sorts of different packages because most of the time they aren't providing, because Ubuntu LTS doesn't have the same promise that Red Hat gives of the enterprise support unless you buy something like Ubuntu Pro. Now still, you can actually use this ecosystem as some sort of Fedora LTS. My distribution, stillOS, is actually built on top of Alma Linux, but we're a atomic distribution using bootc, which means you don't use a package manager to update the distribution. It's basically distributed as one image. The smaller repo that a Rail distribution is going to give you isn't a problem for my distribution because you're going to be using Flatpak anyway for app installation. But if you're one of these distros, like I know Elementary OS, they actually ship all their apps through Flatpak. Maybe they should go with a bootc distribution in the future. But Linux Mint, Pop! OS, Zorin OS, Farron OS, all of those want to be able to ship native dev packages and not have to use Flatpaks for everything. So because of the size of the Ubuntu LTS repo, it still makes a lot of sense for them to use that as a base, even if they're going to have challenges like some of the challenges I talked about in my video on the Ubuntu platform's downfall. Now, the last thing is Ubuntu rules the culture. Ubuntu is easily the most known Linux distribution by non-Linux users, and when Linux is shown in pop culture, it is usually Ubuntu. Like, I remember watching Veronica Mars with one of my college dorm friends, and there's a random Ubuntu mention.
Wait, how can you even have an opinion on Ubuntu if you haven't tried it? 2.6 kernel, live CD. They even had GNOME 2.0 the day Woody Warthog came out.
I remember this article from 2020 where Ubuntu was featured in an anime. Aside from that, as I was talking about earlier, the Ubuntu desktop, even to this day, is just very recognizable, even with GNOME. If I show you a screenshot of the Ubuntu desktop, you know it's the Ubuntu desktop, regardless of if you even use Ubuntu or not. Pretty much every Linux piece of software is going to offer a .deb, and funnily enough, that .deb file is usually made for Ubuntu and not the namesake of the .deb file, which is Debian. And I am curious if Ubuntu reverse snaps, how much of Fedora's momentum would still hold. I think if Ubuntu reverse snaps, yes, Fedora would still be seen as a stable Linux platform and people would still use it. But in terms of the chokehold that Fedora has on influencers right now, that would be it. I think influencers would go back to recommending Ubuntu. Now, with all that said, thank you for watching this video. I'm going to take this opportunity to plug my video right here about how libadwaita ruined, because I think distro branding was a key to Ubuntu becoming as popular as it did. Also, check out my video right here about the downfall of the Ubuntu platform. Help me get to 100K subs, that'd be sick, and help support a broke college student on Patreon. With all that, thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.